All right, U.S. history students, we are going to move on to notes 4.3, and we're going to look at the antebellum economy, and primarily we're going to look at their different regional economies. So the South, the North, and the West each developed specialized regional economies that become connected into a national market, and inventions of the time are going to have significant impacts on each of these regions. So in the South, the invention that is going to revolutionize the Southern economy is going to be the cotton gin. In 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which makes it much easier to refine and process cotton. So removing the seeds from the cotton, essentially, which before the cotton gin was a very labor-intensive, very expensive process. After the cotton gin, it is much, much simpler. Cotton became the dominant cash crop of the Deep South and becomes known as King Cotton. The South provided 75% of the world's cotton and was the main U.S. export by 1840. And if you look at the pie chart above, you can see in 1800, cotton was 7% of U.S. exports. By 1860, it is almost 60% of U.S. exports. Cotton became the cash crop that is going to stimulate the northern textile and shipping industries. So cotton would be grown here. It would be shipped up north using some of those internal improvements that were implemented by Henry Clay, where they would be manufactured into cloth and then exported. King cotton has important effects on America. First, it leads to Western expansion. Cotton is very land intensive, meaning you need a lot of land and you need to be able to move your crops because cotton also depletes the soil. So cotton farmers are going to want to use all of the new Western lands for cotton farming. And cotton, as a result, because as farms expand, the labor needs for those farms expand, and slavery is going to increase in the Deep South significantly. And what we see develop in the Deep South and in the cotton-growing areas of the South is something known as the Black Belt. And the Black Belt refers to the area of the South in which cotton production and the use of slave labor are intensely utilized. And if you look at the slave versus white population in the South at the time, you see that in some states, the slave population actually outnumbered the white population. South Carolina is a good example of that. Mississippi is also a good example of that. Artwork of the time also depicts the reliance on cotton for the Southern economy, the plantation agriculture economy, and the use of slave labor to maintain and sustain the economy in the South. Slave labor was distributed. If you look at the types of work that slaves did, 55% of slaves were dedicated to cotton cultivation, about 15% to domestic work, and only about 10% for tobacco, which had been the primary cash crop of areas like Virginia and North Carolina, particularly during the colonial period. And then we do see slave labor used in mining, industry, and construction as well. Now, when you look at the national population at the time, only about a quarter of the U.S. population owned slaves, and of course those were Southern whites. And those who did own slaves didn't own very many. However, most slaves do live on large plantations, so you can see of the people who owned slaves, the majority of them owned 1 to 9 slaves. Only 0.1% of the population owned more than 100 slaves. Now, the brutality of slavery is well documented, as you can see here with the muzzle, the leg irons, and the ID tag. Branding, these are examples of branding irons. And then these images which depict the whipping and the evidence of the whipping and the scarring of that. This is one of the most famous images used in the abolition movement to depict the brutality and the inhumanity of slavery. Eli Whitney is a pretty prolific inventor, and the northern economy is going to be drastically affected by the use of interchangeable parts, and which is his invention, and also new textile technologies. So the sewing machine, the power loom, and the spinning mule are all inventions that are going to drastically affect factory and textile production in the North. As you can see here, an assembly line factory system for producing cloth is implemented. Of course, the cloth is going to rely heavily on the southern cotton. And in 1790, Samuel Slater used British industrial designs to build the first American textile factory. So interestingly, he actually smuggles the designs out of England and does so illegally. Britain had wanted to keep that knowledge secret. But Samuel Slater brings it to the United States and introduces his technology to textile factories. In the early 1800s, textile mills spread across New England, and they become a very profitable in the New England economy. The most famous textile mill in America was the Lowell Mill in Boston. The Lowell Mill used mechanized machines to mass produce textiles. Lowell typically employed young women known as Lowell girls from the country who lived in boarding houses and worked in the factory. By 1840, northern factories mass-produced textiles, farming equipment, and other finished goods. The growth of factories led to an increase in American cities, and this is a process called urbanization. So prior to 1840, the majority of Americans would be found on farms in rural regions, but after this, we see people starting to move to cities to take advantage of the work in factories. So if you look at this map, you can see city population in 1820, and then you notice the large difference in 1860. The growth of factories creates jobs and leads to an increase of European immigration to the United States. And in the 1840s, millions of Irish and Germans immigrated to America to take advantage of these factory jobs that were becoming available because of technological advancements. Immigrants worked in low-paying factories in New England, or they moved west as farmers. And the rapid immigration led to hostility and prejudice on the part of native-born Americans, and this hostility and prejudice starts a movement called nativism. So when you see examples of people saying things America for Americans or wanting to ban immigration, then that would be considered a nativist belief. Nativists were worried that immigrants would vote, that they would remain poor and become a social burden, and that Catholic immigrants in particular would remain loyal to the Pope. So the Know Nothing Party formed in the 1850s to restrict immigration and limit voting rights. Now, the Know Nothing Party name does not mean that they believed they know nothing, but it was actually a secret party, and when people would ask them about it, they would say, "Oh, I know nothing about that party." Population growth and land opportunities led to rapid growth in the West as well. So new technologies made large-scale farming possible in Western lands. So Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper and John Deere's steel plow allow for massive grain cultivation. And the West is going to become America's breadbasket, where commercial farms produced wheat, corn, and livestock. And so areas like Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas continue to serve that function in America today.